the New York Times had to finally admit that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset. You know, it was never investigated, and that was deliberate. Church committee, they said it was conspiracy. That was the conclusion of the congressional committee. So it should have been called the Dulles Commission.
So recently, RFK Jr. went on Tucker Carlson's podcast to talk a little bit about the truth surrounding the JFK, RFK, and MLK assassinations. Now, RFK Jr. has always sought the truth in these regards, especially being the nephew and the son of two of those assassinated on this list. But now he's on the inside. Now he has access to materials that we probably haven't seen and is discussing the revelations from the JFK files here. So let's watch and let's react. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
We don't have a good track record of revealing the truth in a timely manner. As you know better than anybody, the president on January 23rd issued an executive order ordering the full declassification of files related to the murder of your uncle, father, and Martin Luther King. And, you know, we haven't seen all of them yet. Where is that process? Have your conclusions about any or all of those three murders changed on the basis of new documents?
No, nothing's changed. I mean, you know, as you know, there's already millions of pages of documents out there. And I think, you know, in terms of my uncle's death, I think that, you know, that ship has sailed. I don't think anybody who actually is willing to read the evidence now will question the fact that my uncle was killed by a conspiracy. And that, in fact, Congress in 1973, when the Church Committee looked at I think it was 73. The
75, yeah.
What? 75.
Yep.
Church Committee, they said it was conspiracy. That was the conclusion of the Congressional Committee. So the Warren Committee that was run by Alan Dulles, who was, you know, had a lot of reasons to lie, and did lie throughout. And in fact, he said at one of the sessions, yeah, if we were involved in this, we would lie.
Yeah, that's pretty telling. And Arthur Dulles did become the arch nemesis of Kennedy at the tail end of Kennedy's presidency, because Kennedy fired him from the CIA because of the debacle that was the Bay of Pigs. He saw the power of the CIA, how it was manifesting in a direction that Kennedy didn't want. Kennedy felt manipulated, and you know, part of the release of these recent JFK files show a document that previously was heavily redacted was now unredacted, and showed that Arthur Schlesinger was warning the president about the CIA going rogue, you know, putting agents essentially in the State Department to carry CIA propaganda and the CIA foreign policy that they desired into other branches of government and supplant the elected will of the people and even the president. So this was, you know, certainly the case that it was a corrupt decision that Dulles was at the head of this commission, the Warren Commission, and, you know, basically a lot of the members followed his insights, and I think we know the conclusions. And another thing about these files is it shows the extent to which Oswald was surveilled, not only by the CIA before the assassination, but also after the assassination, that the CIA withheld documents about this surveillance to the Warren Commission, and CIA officials lied under oath regarding this. So yeah, Kennedy's right here. There is more reason to think of a conspiracy, and the recent document release only seems to prove that, or at least heavily substantiate that.
Oh, he said that. And he got himself put on that committee, and he was really, it should have been called the Dulles Commission, or, you know, he said it's a single shooter. But then, you know, in 75, that was 64. So 11 years later, Congress investigated, and they had a much larger purview. They had much more data at that time. And they said it was a conspiracy. But since then, there's been a million documents released, and probably 30 people who were involved and made confessions, including many of the prime actors.
Yeah, one of the craziest things is that we have information that during Oswald's famous trip to New York, or not New York City, Mexico City, which again was surveilled by the CIA, he contacted the Soviet and Cuban embassies. So there's evidence that if he wasn't a CIA operative himself, he was certainly collaborating with other people and, planning this, hostile communist regimes potentially planning this. And if he was a CIA agent, they were looking to see, to keep tabs on him, essentially. So a lot more information was gleaned from this recent release. We knew some of the stuff that existed long before this because of other disclosures. Trump disclosed some information in his first cabinet. But yeah, I agree with them that that Alan Dulles had every reason to try to bury a conspiracy if one existed, especially because of bitterness over his dismissal as head of the CIA. He was the architect of the first 3 American coups, the Bay of Pigs, that disaster that, caused Kennedy to realize that, the CIA should be scattered into 1,000 pieces and scattered to the winds. Iran, which recently comes up because, the U.S. deposed that elected government in Mossadegh in 1953, replacing it with a Shah. And then we got the reactionaries come to power in 1979 and been rattling sabers with them ever since. And then we have Guatemala, where the leader of Guatemala was replaced by a CIA coup too. So Dulles was truly an evil character, and not enough Americans know enough about him.
And so I don't think there's any doubt that my uncle was killed by a conspiracy. My father is more difficult because we just don't have the data. It's never been investigated. And, I've been trying to get it investigated. One of the women who played potentially a key role in it was a woman called one woman in the polka dot dress who appeared to be Sirhan's handler, and that woman is living openly in Tarzana, California. Nobody's ever talked to her, and she, this should be investigated, and people should talk to her and, really investigate the crime. And as you know, and I think I've talked to you about this before, that my father, Sirhan was there. There were 77 eyewitnesses in the kitchen at the time, and he took 2 shots of my father. One of those shots hit Paul Schrade in the head, and Paul Schrade survived. And the other one hit the door jamb behind my father, and it was later removed by the LAPD. And then Sirhan was grabbed by 6 people, including Rayford Johnson, Rosie Greer, Carl Ulrich, who was the manager of the Ambassador Hotel. And they turned his gun, they bent him over the steam table, and they turned his gun away from my father. But it had 6 more shots in it. And he emptied the chamber. So Sirhan, or Rayford, told me that Sirhan had superhuman strength. Sirhan is a little tiny guy. And I've met him and talked to him, but he's kind of a frail. I mean, he's frail now because he's older, but even then he was just a little tiny guy, and was not particularly strong. And Rayford said he had superhuman strength and he could not pry the gun from his hand, and he fired 6 more shots. All those shots hit people. We know what happened to every shot in his gun. And my father was shot by 4 shots from behind. One of them passed harmlessly through the shoulder pad of his, this is what Noguchi's autopsy said, through the shoulder pad of his suit.
Yeah.
And all the others were contact shots, meaning the barrel of the gun was either touching his body or less than 3 inches from his body. The last shot that killed him was behind his left ear. And that shot, Noguchi says, was from 1 to 3 inches from him. And Sirhan was never behind him. Sirhan was always in front of him.
Yeah, so historically, when I've watched RFK, he's suggested that it was a guy named Thane Eugene Caesar that had actually shot his father and killed his father. But that Sirhan did, shoot his firearm, but those shots missed him and Caesar's hit it. So I'm curious if he'll bring that up again.
And A guy who almost certainly took those shots was a security guard who had just gotten his job within a week before. And he was and my father fell down on him. My father must have known that he was being shot, because the last thing he did was he turned and he tore off the clip-on tie from Cesar. Cesar had him by the left hand and had steered him into the ambush. And he had his right hand, his gun in his right hand, and he admitted it. He was seen, my father fell on him, and he pushed my father off him, and he had his gun drawn. And the gun was not taken away from him by the LAPD, which did a terrible job. And, not only a terrible, but a malevolent job, because they destroyed 2,500 photographs that were taken that night before the trial. So there were photographs, 2,500 photographs in that kitchen and the ballroom.
So yeah, I think Caesar's gun is very relevant in this whole thing too. And by the way, I don't have a strong opinion on whether he fired shots at Kennedy at all, but what is known is that Thane Eugene Caesar hated the Kennedys. He hated Robert F. Kennedy and he hated John F. Kennedy, and he said that there's a famous quote out there, if you Google it, essentially that if RFK gets elected, he'll sell the country down the river to the commies, just like his brother did, something like that. But what's relevant is that even by his own account, Cesar did brandish a gun at that time, thinking he might have to defend himself or what have you. That was part of his interview when he was interviewed about this after, but it wasn't a 22, according to him at this time. He said it was a 38 Rome gun at the time. And that was significant because I believe it was known that a 22s had fired the shots into the president and killed the president. Well, it turns out later that he actually did admit to owning a 22, though he says that on that day and then on that occasion, he drew a 38 and not a 22. And he had sold that 22 in the months before that assassination. Well, actually, people did some due diligence on this, tracked down the guy who had bought that gun, the 22, all the way into the 70s, I think like 10 years after the assassination, and found that the receipt was signed by Cesar, and it was actually sold to him months after the assassination, raising some people's thoughts that, Cesar could have been the actual killer here. And that's what I think that RFK has said in other interviews when talking about this. And I don't think he's added that context. So I think it's helpful to know that this is a reason why there's still suspicions about this.
And the LAPD collected them and destroyed them all. And you have to ask, why would they do that? And a lot of the other evidence was also destroyed, including the door jams. And, we have pictures of them, but we don't have the real thing. And then they never confiscated the gun from Cesar. And Cesar said that, I had the gun out because I was going to shoot at Sirhan. And so, that should be questioned.
Yeah, it would be really nice to know what exact gun he had that day, because he says it was a 38, but a 22 was responsible for the assassination. And, if photos were destroyed deliberately because of that, that doesn't actually quell people's suspicions about that, he was involved.
Are there any documents?
And I'll just say this, that yes. Thane Cesar was working at that time. His job was working for the Lockheed plant in Los Angeles. And he had a top security classification at that. And Lisa Pease, who's one of the researchers and authors who's written extensively about this, went through his background. And the only employer that he ever listed officially in his background was the CIA. So there are a lot of questions, and we don't know the answers to them.
This is true, by the way. He did work at Lockheed Aircraft, and it wasn't his full-time job to be a security guard. That's actually what he only did part of the time, and I think he worked under a contractor at that time, being responsible to protect RFK. But this is right as far as I know it, too. And I went down a rabbit hole on this one time, so a lot of this sticks out.
I was in contact with Cesar in 2019, 2020, negotiating with him. He had moved to the Philippines, and I was trying to see if he would talk to me. And I was going to go over there and talk to him, and he said, I'll do it for $5,000. And then when I got close, he said $10,000. And he said 20,000, then he said 30,000. And, and then he just said, no, I'm not going to meet with you.
Kennedy's also said this in previous interviews. I don't think he's ever said 30,000 though. I thought that he said like the final ask of Cesar's was 25,000. That might be a minor discrepancy, but this is again akin to other stories that he's told trying to seek out the truth from Sirhan Sirhan. Though he has talked to Sirhan Sirhan in the past. That is for sure. I'm confusing this. I was talking about Cesar. He has talked to Sirhan Sirhan in the past and while he's been in prison, but he did try to seek out Cesar, and I thought that 25,000 was the ask, the final one.
Yeah, and then he's since passed away. So, again, we don't know, but there are enough kind of flags on it that you would, that if you were actually wanted to know answers, you would be asking questions. And those
Are you confident?
Certainly if there isn't photographs of the people surrounding RFK at that time and that if they were destroyed, I don't know enough about it to say I know they were destroyed and here's where they were destroyed. He seems certain of that. I would need to look into that. But if that's true, yeah, that does cast further doubt on the official narrative. And just to be clear where I stand here and laying my cards on the table, I think there's much more evidence to conclude a grand conspiracy in the JFK assassination than the RFK assassination.
That I know there's been some frustration about getting all the documents relevant to those three murders, those three assassinations. Are you confident that all of it will come out by the end of this term?
I'm confident that President Trump will release anything that he has access to. But, I don't expect anything groundbreaking to come from those documents because, first of all, with my uncle, we've already got everything. There may be little things like, the calendar for Bill Harvey, who is one of the people who was in the CIA, who is almost certainly involved, and other things like that.
Yeah, it's hard to know how groundbreaking document releases ever will be because of these deep state agencies and how they share information and hide information and destroy information. It's not like they've been very forthcoming about Epstein files, that's for sure. But I think that the JFK files release did actually show a lot of things that Americans had long suspected and never known, the extent to which Oswald was surveilled, the extent to which that the CIA was involved in an assassination attempt on the leader of the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo. That's something that very few people talk about, but just following the pattern of CIA regime change operations and assassination attempts, and also the extent to which the CIA covered up their surveillance of Oswald and even lied about it on the stand.
Would be, and then more evidence. I mean, the evidence that came out, the last tranche, the New York Times had to finally admit that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset, which they'd been denying for 50 years. And they finally admitted, yeah, he was.
Really? I am not aware of an article that they wrote on that claiming that he was a CIA asset. If you know the document he's talking about or the article he's talking about, let me know in the comments. I haven't seen that yet, and I would love to see it. I know the New York Times has covered the Kennedy assassination and talked about how, it might lead to a CIA conspiracy, but I haven't heard them say that, this shows he was a CIA asset. Now, it's interesting. If RFK is saying this, he might be privy to documents that we haven't seen yet on JFK, being on the inside now, because the documents that were released never say that, straight off. But they do seem to imply that it was a possibility, namely because of how much the CIA covered their surveillance of him. Why would they do that if not to just obscure that there was a connection? And we know that they were surveilling him before and after the assassination. And when he went to Mexico City and made contact calls with the Cuban and Soviet Union embassy. So I'm not aware of the New York Times going as far as to say he was a CIA asset, but does anyone know what he might be talking about? So he might be either interpreting the documents that were released in a way that we're not, or RFK Jr. might be privy to documentation we haven't seen. But I don't think the New York Times claimed that, but I am willing to eat crow. Let me know down below if you've seen that.
Working for the CIA. And so, there may be some more validation of what, he was doing and how he was recruited, et cetera. But I don't think it's going to be anything groundbreaking. I don't think you need anything groundbreaking. I think, listen, I was a prosecutor. If I had to try the case right now, against a number of the people are dead, I believe I could win in front of a jury with the evidence that we got.
Yep.
With my dad, it was never investigated, and that was deliberate.
Yeah, there are lingering questions in both of those cases, to be sure. Like I said before, I think that there is a much cleaner and more logical case to the JFK assassination being the result of a conspiracy with CIA involvement than Sirhan was part of a conspiracy. There are some open questions that would have been nice to have been answered if we had photographs of and know what kind of gun Caesar had. But, that might never be possible now, and especially because he's dead, there might never be conclusive answers as far as that goes. But Sirhan is still in prison for that. And, I think that one of the best things that Trump has done is release the JFK files. I did a video on that, telling about how much I appreciated that because it really did shed more light than we had known. I think the Schlesinger letter in particular shed a lot of light that the regime didn't want us to know, and that's the extent to which the CIA was involved in its own foreign policy, crafting its own foreign policy, if that makes any sense, that was distinct from the elected government that Americans had elected in the presidential elections and in Congress. Instead of that, they were embarking on a rogue project to kind of empire build before that term really completely came to fruition, especially in the later years of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st century, or later years of the 21st century and early years of the 21st century. So that's where we're at. There are open questions. RFK Jr. has been talking about this issue for a large period of his life, and he spent a lot of time seeking truth. He's interviewed a lot of the players, but, we can look back at that documentation and come to our own conclusions, I suppose. I wouldn't say this administration has been very beholden to transparency when it comes to some of the others. I don't know if they're just looking through all the documents again, deciding what to unredact. About the MLK and the RFK files, we'll have to see that. Hopefully we're privy to more information regarding that. What I can tell you is MLK's family still maintains that the FBI played a role in his murder, and it's hard not to believe that, especially after the FBI tried to convince him to commit suicide by sending him a letter and suggesting and implying that that's the only thing he could do, when he was on the cusp of winning the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. So, transparency is always a problem with government, and especially with our deep state that wants to cover all of its rough and villainous tracks, that's for sure. But hopefully we get more answers here. I thought some of Kennedy's input here was interesting. Some things that he shed light on that a lot of Americans don't know, but there are more questions than answers still. So let me know in the comments below, do you agree with RFK Jr.? Was both his father and his uncle's assassinations the result of conspiracies? Am I off base? Anything you want to correct or add to that? Let me know down below. Like my video, subscribe to the channel, and consider joining as a Patreon patron or YouTube member. If you join as a YouTube member, you get advanced viewing of all of my videos before they come out to the public. So I really appreciate you if you support me in that way also. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.